So perception of sound sounds exciting, right? No pun intended. All right. Last week we talked about physics and biology of sound, but we didn't really talk about, again, that perceptual process, right? We said, hey, here's a sound, here's a sound wave, it's going to vibrate your cochlea, woohoo, you've got cells that get excited by that, and that was awesome. But we didn't talk about some of the evidence that's related to perception of loudness, right? That's related to, let's say, pitch perception, auditory streams, things like that, right? So that's what we're going to discuss today. All right, so if we're talking about loudness, this is definitely going to correspond with intensity. So think about amplitude, right? Okay, so which is kind of cool. So how would we do this? Well, we would do like something called a loudness matching task, right? So we would give you some sort of comparison sound, and then we would have you adjust the loudness of some other sound until you thought the two of those matched. We could use some fancy scientific measurements to determine the difference in those two sounds. We could determine how proficient you are at matching the loudness of two particular sounds, right? What's really sort of interesting is that low frequency sounds tend to lack loudness compared to high frequency sounds, right? So if you were to play two sounds at the same intensity, right? So they're the exact same decibel rating, and one of those is a higher frequency, that's going to be you're going to perceive that as much louder than if that comes through at a lower frequency, right? Does that make sense to everybody? And we kind of think about this if you think about the words, right? I mean, when you describe a low rumble, right? That might be the same intensity as something that's coming through as a high, like a screech or a squall or something, right? But those higher frequencies, we perceive those as a bit more severe.
So would thunder be a low frequency or a high frequency? Because thunder's kind of low, but it's definitely loud as hell.
Yeah, I mean, and thunder's kind of a tricky one too, because sometimes you get like the cracks, right, that are going to be a higher frequency. But if it's like more of the low frequency rumbles, I mean, it is loud, of course. But if you were to compare that to the same sort of decibel rating but a higher frequency, that higher frequency you would perceive it as much louder.
Isn't the rumble just like the original crack fading over a certain distance?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, most of the time you're not, thankfully, like right there where the thunder happened.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So is there like a change that it would? I'm guessing the sound just sort of dissipates over time, so to speak.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
And we talked a little bit about it last week as well. This actually has some interesting sort of evolutionary points, right? How many of you stub your toe and go, ow? Like, no, right? Nobody does it. When you feel pain, you don't emit this like low frequency noise, right? You emit a high frequency noise, and we perceive that as louder, which is great because it's an alarm signal, right? So we're going to be more likely to respond to that in some sort of threatening way. How many of you love when people scratch their fingernails on chalkboards, right? That's always a fun one. Right? There's some idea that that's actually a signal noise that was used sort of in not just humans, but sort of other hominids before humans as an alert signal. And that's why it gets you all riled up, right? I wish I had like some kind of noisemaker where I could hit that button and just make that screeching sound. All right, so again, we talked about loudness and decibels, not a big deal. There's some interesting theories. Again, remember in this book, the guy doesn't buy into a specific theory and kind of force feed you that. He'll present to you the different ideas about why we perceive loudness or whatever it is in a particular range. There's a thing called the excitation pattern model. I'm not going to ask you a whole lot about this, but the idea is basically that loudness, you're going to perceive something as louder if that total neural activity is going to increase, right? So as the intensity of the sound increases, there's some idea that neural activity would increase in relation to that, and you're going to go, wow, that's loud, right? And that's going to scale with that. The problem with that is It doesn't really work that way, right? Because you have about a dynamic range of about 120 decibels, right? So you have this 120 decibel sort of range. Anything above or below that. Now it's not 0 to 120 necessarily, right? Because there's some, you have to get up high enough, right? So anything above or below your range, you're not going to hear that, right? But what's interesting about this is not all of your nerve fibers actually respond to all of the intensities, right? So Kyle, what we would have to have for this excitation pattern model to be true, each nerve fiber would have to respond a little bit, to every intensity, and as intensity increases, they're going to respond more and more. But that's not true. Some fibers respond to lower intensities. They don't do anything if there's a higher intensity. Some fibers need that higher intensity. They don't do anything for the lower intensity, right? So that total neural activity idea doesn't really work. And then we're going on to pitch frequency because nobody has another idea about how that works. So there you go. That's a theory. There's a hole in the theory. Folks are still working to try to figure this out, right? I think that this is a really cool problem, actually. You guys don't get too excited about it. That's fine. What about pitch perception, right? And frequency selectivity. So we'll think a little bit more about this. If we're thinking about pitch, again, that's going to be that perceptual measure. Frequency is going to be the physical measure, right? And so we're thinking about, again, what is the distance between the peaks on these waveforms? How many of those peaks are we jamming into 1 second, right? There is this concept called masking, right? So basically what we do is we have a tone and we want you to tell us the frequency of that tone, right? Is it higher or is it lower? What we will do is place some sort of other noise on top of that. You can think about like white noise, right? If you were playing white noise and then you had a tone playing simultaneously with that, and we had to have you pick out the tone and say, hey, is that, what is that particular frequency or that pitch, right? What's interesting is that if the masking is similar to the frequency of the signal, then it's really going to make it difficult on you to pick out that signal, right? If the mask is farther away in frequency from the signal, then it's going to be easier for you to identify. It makes a lot of sense, right? What's interesting about this is your ability to pick out these signals really maps what we find in the auditory fiber, in those nerve fibers, right? So there really is this kind of nice matching with that frequency tuning between the physiological components that you have and the your sort of behavioral capabilities to pick that out. So it's always nice, Eli, when those things match, right? When they don't match, you're like, well, we have no idea why. There's something else going on, we've not figured it out. But this kind of makes some sense. All right, now what about frequency discrimination, right? Can you tell the difference between two frequencies? So how would we do this? We just, play more than one frequency and you go, hey, which one's higher, which one's lower? Can you tell the difference or not? Some of them might be the same. At low frequencies, we're actually pretty good at this. And we're actually pretty good such that we can tell like a 1% difference, right, in low frequency. So if something's a low frequency and we change that by as little as 1%, we can detect that difference. When we get to higher frequencies, we start to lose that sort of sensitivity and it really deteriorates. So as things get higher, those frequencies are more and more similar and it's harder for us to tell the difference, right? So that's exciting. So if you think about some of the things that might be in that lower end of frequencies, human speech, for example, right, is going to fall into that sort of lower end or that mid-range. So we're going to be pretty good at determining sort of differences there, which is going to be great so that you can identify other folks, right, by their voice. Okay, I know we've all got this magic thing called caller ID right now, right? That's so great. But even before then, you had a thing called voice ID, right? You just like pick up the phone, and you're like, you probably know who that person is, right? You're pretty good at determining that.
Is there anything to like people who are related sounding the same?
Certainly. So what makes noise from a human, right? Like stuff right here,
Mm-hmm.
okay? If you're genetically related to someone, the stuff you've got right here is probably pretty similar, right? Also, if you're living in the same environment as that person, any environmental effects are going to be more similar than they would from someone living somewhere else, right? So definitely genetics and environment there would be, contributors. Now, If you have identical twins, they'll probably sound pretty similar, but let's say one of them decides to become I don't know, a high school basketball coach and they yell all the time, right? Once they've done that for 10 years, and let's say the other person was a librarian, yeah, great. Yeah, great. Probably their voices are going to have some different qualities once they get a bit older, right? So that was a good question. Speaking of that, hey, who wants to hear about tonal languages versus non-tonal languages?
Me.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting. And this actually relates to genetics and vocal cords, right? So it's actually kind of cool. So there are there are all kinds of ways you can categorize languages, right? But one way you can do this is tonal languages and languages that aren't tonal, non-tonal, right? So tonal languages tend to be languages that come from like Southeast Asia, right? So if you think about Chinese being a tonal language, the same word, if they pronounce that sort of in 5 different ways, it means 5 completely different things, right? And I know you're thinking, well, in English, don't we have words that are like that as well? And it's like, well, not exactly, right? It's a little different. There are homonyms and synonyms, and don't worry about it. So in Chinese, they'll have one word, and you say it 5 different ways, and it means 5 completely different things, right? So it's tonal. One of the reasons that folks who are not of Asian genetic heritage have difficulty with those languages is because the DNA that controls the structure of your vocal cords is a little different, right? So if you start to think about, let's think about Thailand versus Poland. I don't know if anybody's ever been to either of those places, right? But you can imagine Thailand is very humid, right? And Poland is not, right? And so Thai is going to be, it's not, right? That's it, it's just not. It's just not humid. So you're going to have nice kind of stretchy vocal cords, right? Because of the humidity over time. Folks with stretchier vocal cords are going to be better at producing those languages. If you're in Poland, your vocal cords are not going to stretch, right? So there's no point, having vocal cords to do that. You're not going to develop a language that's going to have or require that particular characteristic of your vocal cords.
That is actually really cool.
I told you it was cool. Not all my stories are, but that one actually was pretty interesting,
I
right?
enjoyed that.
Yeah. So there you go. What about pure tones? What do we know about pure tones? They're kind of interesting. This is actually very straightforward, right? When we think about what pitch that we perceive and what neural activity we have. The reason for that is because of that frequency to place conversion, right? We already talked about that. We said your cochlea has from low frequencies to high frequencies. Whichever of those hair cells are activated, that's the frequency that you're hearing, right? And so we can directly map that perception to that neural activity. Again, we exploit this setup to create cochlear implants, right? There's this guy Helmholtz, sort of a bright guy. Helmholtz had, actually Helmholtz is probably one of the most influential folks in like all of science history. He did a lot of stuff. But one of the things that he did is he came up with this idea, we now call it place theory. Basically the idea is that, again, that basilar membrane, that cochlea vibrates. Wherever it's vibrating the most, that's the pitch you're going to perceive, right? So this guy had that idea back in the late 1800s, and we have yet to find a better alternative to that because it's just how it works. There's also this other theory called timing theory. It's a little more complicated. Basically, what timing theory assumes is that the person listening to whatever these tones are, they're measuring the difference between those neural activities, the neural firing. Now, if we think about a frequency, for example, what we discussed last week was your hair cells are firing action potentials in time with the peaks of that sound wave, right? And so they're going to fire at a certain rate, a certain frequency. We can measure the difference between one of those firings and the firing of some other set of cells that's sensitive to a different frequency, and we can compare those two, the time between those two peaks, right? The time between those firings. Seems pretty complicated, but it's does make a lot of sense, right? It would be possible, it is possible for us to discriminate sounds that way. Right? So if something has a higher frequency, and then there's something with a low frequency, we can discriminate those two by looking at the timing of the peaks, right? If we sort of measure the timing of those peaks, we can say, hey, this was a higher frequency, and this was a lower frequency. Does that make sense? It's kind of cool. That works for simple tones, right, or for pure tones. What about those complex tones, right? Because we said on top of that sine wave, we're going to add all of those other sine waves, making all of those wrinkles, right? That becomes a little complicated. And so we get into this idea of harmonic frequencies. And so this is where we'll probably spend a little bit more of our time, because most of you are not just running around listening to pure tones, right? Okay, they're complex tones, things that you're hearing out in the world, right? So basically, any complex tone is going to contain a series of what we call harmonic frequency components, right? Last week we talked about that fundamental frequency, and we said there are two important characteristics about the fundamental frequency. It has the lowest frequency, right, Chandler? And it has the highest amplitude. Okay, so we know those two things. Because of that, it gives that tone its characteristic quality, right? Whatever that pitch is, okay? And then from that, we have things called harmonics. So we have other sine waves on top of that fundamental, right? Coming through simultaneously. And we said that they're actually whole number multiples of that lowest frequency, right? So if that lowest frequency is 5 hertz, harmonics could be 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 hertz, whatever, right? It can't be 27 hertz or 16 hertz, right? Because those aren't whole number multiples. Now it gets a little tricky, 5's an easy number to do math, right, Alina? But what if it's like 3.5 hertz? Or what if it's 22.7 hertz, right? And then you've got to like pull out the calculator and say, well, what's 3 times 22.7? And that's a possible harmonic. Does that make sense to everybody? So we have those harmonics. Typically, we think that the pitch that we hear is determined by that fundamental frequency, but there's a huge problem here, Charlotte. And that problem is called the missing fundamental, right? Remember that fun thing we thought about last week called Fourier analysis? Tabby, we had so much fun with that, right? And I'm sure you went home and you just went to the library, got all the books you could on, the fast Fourier transform, right? But the idea was we could take that complex form, we could break it down into these sine waves, okay? So we do that. We have all these individual components. What we can do then is we can delete one of those components, right? We can filter one of those components out. If it's one of the harmonics, you think, well, that's probably not going to have much of an effect, right? Because Emily, these are just little things riding on the top that give it, kind of a little extra flavor, right? They're not really driving the pitch. But what if we were to actually delete that fundamental frequency, right? The frequency that we thought was the one that was most important. What's really interesting when we do that is you still perceive the pitch as the same, right? So if I'm playing a C sharp on a trumpet and you're listening to that note and then we delete out that fundamental frequency, right? It's still going to sound like a C sharp. It's not really going to change, okay? So you're still going to hear that as if you were listening to the fundamental. Why?
Yeah.
We'll talk about it. Well, nobody really knows why. There are some possible theories why. We'll talk about that.
Okay.
That's a great question.
Can you stay on that for just a second moment?
I went back to it, Alex. I was just...
I know.
All right. Alex is ready for it now. After you've taken my classes 2 or 3 times,
It's not my fault that, well, it is my fault that I'm slow at writing, but it's not something that's easily fixable.
it's fine. Take your time. Yeah, we only have 19 slides to go. We're good. I know. It's going to be amazing.
I know this is probably a dumb question, but we're not going to have a study guide, are we? You don't love us that much, right?
Marissa, do you want to tell them? I've never made a study guide in my life.
I assumed not. You did not seem like the type.
I knew there was a reason I had taken your classes.
Yeah, no study. Why would you want a study guide? It's a waste of time.
It helps.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
I gave you a study guide. It was called the syllabus.
It's-
I think now's a good time to start making study guides.
Think now's a good time?
Yeah, like right
2
now.
weeks ago was a good time to
2
start
weeks
making
ago.
study.
I'll tell you what, I'll work on my writing speed, you work on making a study guide.
All right.
Maybe some hints of, what we really should be focusing on?
Yeah.
Just a few sprinkled in
Anything?
there.
But, Marissa, what do they have in this class
Huh?
that could help guide them on what they need to know?
The lecture recordings.
Okay, well, they have something else too.
Labs.
Those are great. Keep going.
Books.
That's great. Keep going.
What else do you want?
They have you and Josh.
Oh, yeah, we have.
Yeah. Yeah, those guys can help you too. Those are your study guides. In the,
But
in
we're not
the,
able to access them 24/7.
yeah, you are.
Yeah.
Send them an email. They'll get back to you within 15 minutes.
At 3 a.m.?
Why not?
Honestly, though, probably. Like,
They probably keep the same hours you do. If you're up studying at 3 a.m., one of them will be up studying at 3 a.m. as well, right? You could probably safely assume that. Give it a try. See what happens.
as far as like essay questions, what are we supposed to do? Define essay. Like,
We'll talk about it.
okay.
All right.
Usually short answer for you.
It says short answer and essay on the
Oh.
syllabus, so that's why I was asking.
Yeah, you'll have both.
Okay.
All right. So, what are some other ideas about pitch perception? There's one called the temporal theory. This is basically saying that complex sounds are encoded based on the beat frequency, right? So, what do we mean by beat frequency? The beat frequency is actually created by those higher harmonics, right? Which is cool, because then we can bypass that missing fundamental problem, right? So if we delete the missing, or we delete the fundamental, we still have the higher harmonics, right? Those higher harmonics are still creating that beat frequency that we would hear. And so then that could explain why that missing fundamental doesn't change the perceived pitch of the sound, right? So that makes some sense, that's helpful.
Could you elaborate on beat frequency and stuff like that?
Yeah, so it's just going to be, so when you're thinking about those higher when you think about a sine wave, right, like this, so it's got some kind of frequency to it, but there's going to be a higher frequency, right, that's going to be coming through because of those higher frequency sine waves, those harmonics that are going on top, right, and all of those are actually going to be activating hair cells as well, right, at that higher frequency, okay, and that's what we call the beat frequency. It's just that higher frequency sort of embedded in that complex tone or complex sound. And again, even if we get rid of that fundamental frequency, because the beat frequency is really composed of the higher frequency harmonics, that's still going to be present in the sound. It's not going to be changed. All right. Let's see. Then there was this guy Goldstein. He had an idea, and he said basically, why does the missing fundamental not change the perceived pitch? And his idea was, well, your brain's doing some math, right, Skylar, even if you don't know it. And the math it's doing is sort of in reverse. If I say, here are the fundamental, or here are the harmonics, what's the fundamental, right? And so if I were to give you a number of frequencies, and I said, these are the harmonics, you could do this on pen and paper, right? JC, you could calculate what's the lowest common denominator, is basically what I'm asking here. And you could figure out what that fundamental is, whether it's present or not, right? And your brain possibly does that. That's this idea Goldstein had. And that is a great theory, and it does explain why the missing fundamental would work. What did I not say in that, Kyle? I didn't say we had any evidence that shows that this is how it works, right? I just said this guy had a good idea, and that might be how it works. Then, I just want you to be able to say this word, autocorrelation, because this is a really sort of a tricky one, right? So it's kind of like you're kind of like you're playing the waveform over and over again, right? You're processing it over and over again, and you're sort of measuring the space between the spikes from your brain cells, and based on that you can calculate what that frequency is, even if the fundamental is missing. I'm not going to ask you much about that. It's a pretty complicated theory. Most of the time, your brain's going to do whatever is the simplest, right? And so I think one of these complicated theories may or may not actually be the best. All right, so that's stuff about pitch perception. We already talked a little bit about auditory localization. We'll visit that again. We did that lab last week where you guys went kind of left and right. I mean, that was a lot of fun, I guess, right? How many of you really enjoyed that lab activity? It was all right, right? It was better than like sucking on limes, right? Definitely, right? And they're just going to keep getting better each week. So basically there's sort of like three things you want to know if you're going to localize the sound. Where is it left, right? How far is it up or down? And then what's the distance from you, right? So you kind of have an X, Y, and a Z coordinate. You'll find it. There's a concept called the minimum audible angle. This is kind of cool. This is the smallest difference you can tell in what we call the azimuth. Think about that kind of like horizontally out there in the world, right? What's the smallest difference that you can tell between two sound locations, right? And that's going to be your minimum audible angle, which is kind of cool. What's really interesting about this is there's a bit of a breakdown of this between 1500 and 1800 hertz, right? So sounds that are between 1500 and 1800 hertz, you don't do as well determining where those are located, right? And what's really interesting about that is right around that frequency there's a handoff between the two systems that handle sound localization, right, in that sort of horizontal domain. So anything less than about 2000 hertz, we're looking at timing differences, right? So if it's less than 2000 hertz, we're looking at what's the time difference between when it hits my left ear and my right ear, or my right ear and my left ear, right? So for those sort of lower frequencies, that's what we're using, right? Okay. For higher frequencies above 2000 hertz, we're actually not using timing, but we're using level. In that case, we're going to use intensity, right? So the reduction in intensity is more important to us. And if you think about this for a few moments, right? Lower frequencies, we have fewer peaks, right? And so measuring the time distance between fewer peaks is probably easier, right? Because it's a longer time. So we can measure, you know, that timing difference better, right? And so we have those periods when we're not going to be activated as much. When you get to a higher frequency and the peaks are closer and closer together, it becomes a much more difficult task to measure the difference between the arrival of those peaks in the left ear and the right ear, right? Because so many peaks are hitting at almost the same time. And in that case, what's going to be a better option for us is measuring the intensity, right? The amplitude of that waveform. Does that make sense? And it happens again right around that 2000 hertz. So that's why we start to have a breakdown in performance there. Questions about that? Great. Elevation is kind of cool. Now, when we were looking at sort of the azimuth measurement, we needed 2 ears for that, right? How soon does it arrive to one ear compared to the other? But elevation is actually what we call a monaural cue. That means we only need 1 ear, right? And that's going to be related to the pinna, right? It's going to do some filtering. This is why you'll constantly kind of like tilt your head around, right? To figure out where a sound is located. And this creates something called the, it's like a cone of confusion. How many of you live in a cone of confusion? Yeah, that's what I thought, right?
Every Thursday, 4 to 6:20.
It's okay. I promise this will all make sense sometime, right? 4 or 5 years. So the cone of confusion comes out of your ear, right? And what that means is if there's a sound, there are a number of sounds that could be created, and based on the characteristics of that sound, you don't know where it's coming from. There's some ambiguity, right? So if you hear a sound, comes into your ear, and you think, well, where is that sound located? All right, well, how am I going to determine where it's located? Well, let me shift my ear, and then let me hear the sound again, right? And then I'm taking that cone and I'm shifting the cone, so now I have 2 data points, and then I think, well, where did that overlap? Where did those cones overlap? And the more you do this, then you can start to isolate where that's coming from, right? It's a little hard to draw. I wish I had a marker now. see if this blue one works. Because this is sort of an important concept, right? So that's an ear, right? And there's a cone that comes out.
Do you want this?
Yeah. You can throw it out there.
Sorry, that was a bad throw.
It's an amazing catch.
Yeah.
Though. All right, so we've got an ear, and we've got a cone that comes out from there, right? It's a 3D cone. And so there's a noise somewhere on that cone, right? Now, we don't know where that is because this cone, right, we don't have detailed information. It could be anywhere on that cone, right? If we tilt our ear a little bit, and then we have another cone that comes out. That cone's in a different location, right? But what we see is there's a little bit of overlap. Where those two cones would overlap, so it would be kind of like this area. Now, that's the only place where that sound could be located, right? Because it has to be in both of those cones. And the only place where those cones overlap is that little sliver. Okay, so we've narrowed down the potential location of this, right? Now, Mary, what we'll do is we'll move our heads again, right? And this time, let's say we create a cone that goes up this way. And now, we just have this very narrow sliver. Maybe even we've narrowed it down to a particular spot, right, where that particular sound is located. And so we can sort of process of elimination, figure out where it is. Does that make sense? Questions about that?
Okay, last week I asked you about like the people with ears that like stick out from their head. If they have bad hearing from like behind them, does that make that worse?
I don't know that you're going to notice a huge sort of difference, right? Again, because of all of the other stuff you've got in there. But if you had a really, let's say you had a really sort of severely cupped ear, right? Then I think that might create some problems because you're not going to be, you know, I mean most folks' pinnas are fairly flat against their head, right? So they have a pretty broad collection area. If your ear was really, you can just walk around like this for a while and see what happens. I promise no one will laugh at you after the first 4 or 5 days.
So why is it when people want to hear better than this?
Yeah, because they're in front of you and it kind of extends the size of their pinna so they can grab more sound. But it sounds completely different if you do this,
It
right?
does, yeah.
Yeah, it's a completely different experience. All right.
Another random question. What about when people get like water in their ear?
Yeah, so that's going to change the flow of the sound, right? Because the water is a different media than the air. So it's going to change that. It's like a filter, right? So it's going to filter out some frequencies, and whatever you're receiving onto your eardrum and then on into your cochlea is going to be different than what you anticipate.
But like as far as the fluid that's already in your ear.
You're used to that. It's been there your whole life.
No, but like when the water gets in your ear, how does it displace the fluid is what I'm asking.
The water is stuck in your ear canal.
Okay, so it's
I
not
was gonna ask
far
where-
enough.
Yeah, it's not getting past, unless you have a perforated eardrum, it's not getting past the eardrum,
Gotcha.
right? And then it possibly could. But I don't think then it's still probably not going to cause, you can get infections and stuff back in there though. That's a different story, because you got tubes coming up in the
Right.
side.
So what makes it so difficult to get the water out of your ear? Because
Surface tension.
Got it.
It's a small hole.
So don't stab it with a Q-tip?
They always tell you don't stab anything with a Q-tip. That's on the box. I think the best thing is if you're going to be swimming in water, like get some earplugs.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody is a swimmer. I think so. But they make like wax earplugs that you can get, that you can like mold to the like shape of your pen. Those are pretty good. Yeah, they're actually pretty good. Because they don't come out as easily, so you don't have like that little like foam thing. And because they're not foam, what can foam do? And it can absorb water, right? And it can kind of wick water through. So if you have the wax, it just creates like a seal. There's a company called Max. They're kind of nice.
Do
They're
you
also
swim? Do you like to swim?
no, but I like to not do it. And so I have a box of them at home. You just get these little wax balls and you just they're great for like airplane rides, things like that. Eli, you had a question?
Yes, does like your earlobe have anything to do with how well you hear?
You're, like down here?
Yeah.
I don't think so. You can cut them off.
Well, I mean, because I have my ears like they're stretched, and I didn't know if that would like affect the way I hear at all.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah. The ear pods,
Yeah.
those earbuds are gonna do it to you, but nothing else.
I was waiting for when that was
I-
going to
Every time, every time. Good question.
Okay, never mind.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead. Let's have it.
Okay, people that can hear better, like a tremendous amount better, and like notice more sounds. What's going on with their ears?
Yeah, it's honestly probably not their ears. I mean, it could be their ears, but again, you know, we talked about like putting a giant engine in your little car. You've got to have the other parts that work as well, right? And so some folks are just more, you know, they've got to have the back end as well that works, right? You're really concerned about people with like big ears. I don't know why this is.
No, I was actually thinking like there are people that like come back from like war and stuff, and they'll be able to hear like really freaking well, and it's really scary. Because you'll like drop a pin and they'll know from like across like the hall.
Yeah, I mean, some of that could be some other sort of psychological issues and sensitivity, right? So it's like, can you hear it, and do you even care, right? So those are two different questions.
Okay.
You hear a lot of stuff, but you filter it out. We'll talk about that in like 12 weeks about attention, right? And what you think. Are you ready?
Oh, no, you can keep it if you want to.
No, I don't need to draw anything else. Can you catch it?
Hopefully. Yeah.
So the pinna, we talked about that stuff. Great. Distance. Here you go, Alex. This is just for you. Sound dissipates over distance, right?
Right.
And so there's some math formula. You don't need to know it, but if you're right next to it, it's going to make a big wave like this. And then if you're like 5 miles from it, it's going to do this, right? How many of you have ever lived next to railroad tracks? Yeah, that's fun, right? So you hear the train go through, like that, and then the rest of us who might live farther away, we just hit, it's kind of nice. Oh, hey, there's something called precedence. Hey, how many of you have heard about this? Anybody know about echoes? Echoes? No. Don't worry about it. So this is sort of a weird thing, right? You could potentially, with an echo, make the wrong assessment of where that sound is coming from, right? Because the sound is here, and then it's traveling, and then it's vibrating and bouncing off something else, and you're hearing the sound coming from somewhere else, right? And so the echo can really cause you problems. But your auditory system's pretty good at this, and it goes, hey, if I heard a sound first, and then I hear the exact same sound just a little bit later, I'm going to assume that second one's an echo. I'm just going to filter that out. I'm not going to worry about it. It's called precedence. Let's see if this will work. Let's find the mouse. Well, I don't know what happened here. Teach me to triple click on something. I don't know why I can't get this to play. There we go. Well, that's a problem. I will get these files to you so that you can play them. I think in the conversion process there was a small lapse. Anyway, this is just showing you sort of 3 or 5 different, I guess 5 different setups. This is showing you a tone or a click actually, and then here's a second click that comes later. If that offset is pretty far, like 50 milliseconds, and you hear 2 clicks, you're going to assume that's 2 different sound sources, right, if they're far enough apart. If you offset that only by about 5 milliseconds, right, because they're happening so close together in time, your auditory system will assume that that second click is just an echo of the first one, right, and you really only pay attention to the first. Obviously, if they both happen at the same time, you're just going to hear 2 clicks from 2 different places. Okay. Don't worry about formant frequencies. And we're not going to talk a lot about speech mode, although you've got some special brain regions that process speech, so that's exciting, right? We should spend a small moment talking about auditory scene analysis. Okay. How many of you have ever been in an environment where sound waves are coming from many, many sources, right? And Skylar, you were at one of those locations yesterday, right? There's that guy yelling on a speaker, there were people sitting at your table, there were all kinds of other sounds. You had to try to pay attention to what was important, right? And you had to decide, well, should I listen to this guy talking, or is this boring story this guy's telling me any good? But this is a question I got to try to answer, right? And so you have to kind of figure out what those sound sources are. And so we do this sort of like segmentation process, right? We're going to decompose those streams into separate sort of processes. There's sort of a couple ways that we might do this. One is that we look at temporal proximity, similarity, and location. And based on that, we assign those sounds to different streams, right? Things that are similar frequencies or have similar amplitudes. Maybe they're coming from the same location at the same time. We're going to assume that's sort of one source of information. Things coming from somewhere else would do different, would come from a different location. If we're doing that, that's what we call sequential. If we're doing what we call simultaneous auditory grouping, basically we're just taking everything in sort of at once and then really just using that pitch and harmonic information and using that to determine, what those streams are. Don't worry about that too much. I wish this worked, but it's not a big deal. Basically what happens here is two different pitches play together. They're fairly close. They kind of sound like they're coming from the same place. It's one continuous stream. If we play those in a much shorter time interval, or if we separate those, right, by frequency quite a bit, you actually start to think of them as two separate auditory streams, right? So they're not going to sound like they're coming from the same source. All right, we should talk about hearing dysfunction. There are really sort of three types of hearing dysfunction that you need to think about. One is what we call conductive, right? This is an issue with the tympanic membrane or the ossicles. So we're not able to conduct that sound wave into the rest of your auditory system as we should, right? Okay. So if you have a ruptured eardrum, I don't know if anybody's ever experienced that. They're so much fun, aren't they, Sonny? No, they're actually quite painful, right? And they cause a real problem. Now that can heal up later and so forth, but damage to your tympanic membrane is a little more common than damage to your ossicles, right? But that can happen. The second type of hearing dysfunction is what we call sensorineural. This is when you have damage to the cochlea or the auditory nerve, right?
How would you damage your ossicles?
Yeah,
Bones, aren't they?
they are bones. If you had some sort of, you have to have a pretty severe whack in the head, I think, or if you had, some inflammatory issues, if you had something like that, right? If you had some severe infections or damage from an infection, right, that could cause some conduction issues.
Could you do some type of damage to your ear by letting a bunch of earwax just build up and just stay in there for forever?
Huh.
Because people have problems with that.
Yeah. So, side note, I probably have the cleanest ear canals you'll ever find. I'm constantly cleaning my ears, which is, I don't know, good, I guess. There are a couple things I can think of. Obviously, if there's a lot of waxy buildup, you could reduce the input of that sound wave, right? You're just going to jam up your ear. The only other thing I can think of is if the wax, and this can't happen, right? It can get attached to your eardrum, and then if you try to remove that, maybe some of your eardrum comes with it.
Oh,
I know, right? That sounds so wonderful, doesn't it? Yeah.
What is the actual purpose of earwax?
Yeah.
How
So
does it help your body?
right. So that's actually a great question. I'm not sure. Somebody probably knows. I think it's like a lot of the sort of.
It's like the mucus in your nose.
Yeah, I was going to say like a lot of the stuff you squirt out of other places. It's to trap dust and parasites, right? Which is not as much of a problem for those of us who live in a millennia with fewer issues with dust and parasites, right? But if you dialed the clock back a little bit, and this was before Q-tips and like earplugs and showers, you could imagine there being more problems. So it's definitely to trap stuff before it gets in. Right? Which, if you've ever had something in your ear, you'll. I had a moth fly in my ear one time. Oh yeah, yeah, that was pretty crazy. It was like trying to get in my house, you know, and the because there's like the light, right? But
I'm not sure for that.
yeah. So what the trick is, you got to go to the bathroom. The reason most you would go to the bathroom is because Chandler, there aren't any lights, right? Or there aren't any windows, right? So you need to go somewhere really dark and then like get a flashlight and shine it because the moth will go to the light. Brilliant, right? And then it just flies right out.
That's so scary.
You just hear it in there.
I'm not okay.
It's like there's a helicopter in your ear.
My grandma had a bee stuck in her ear.
Really?
Yeah, it like flew in her ear, and she's like driving to the doctor with this bee in her ear, and she gets there and she's just like freaking out, and then she just leans her head over and it just like falls out, and
Wow,
it's dead.
that's pretty crazy. Earwax killed it. There you go. Kyle, earwax will kill the bee. All right. Chandler, do you have a question?
I was going to bring up bot flies, but it's not important.
You were going to bring up what?
Bot flies?
Oh.
How you have to, like, if they call in your skin or ear or something, you either have to do the similar thing with the light or suffocate them. Like
Yeah.
go underwater or, like, cover them with passing or something.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Chloe?
Is tinnitus like a psychological?
So that's like the next line. We'll talk about that.
I know. Jumping ahead.
Yeah, that's fine. So that's good because we do need to get moving. The third type of sensory loss is what we call central auditory processing disorder, or tinnitus is a different thing. But the problem with these CAPDs or tinnitus is that there's like no place where there's damage, right? If your auditory nerve has been severed or degraded, if your cochlea is damaged, if you've punctured your eardrum, we can go, hey, we know where the problem is. But there are these central auditory processing disorders and tinnitus. There's no, as of yet, there's no place that we know is damaged. So we assume that it's somewhere in your brain, right? Something in your brain's not working. It's in your brain. It's not working right, and we just don't know why. And that's what it is. So that's why like tinnitus is. I don't know if anybody suffers from that or knows someone who suffers from that. It's like everybody has ringing in their ears sometimes, right? So if you have ringing in your ear, don't freak out. If you have ringing in your ear all the time and you can't sleep and you can't concentrate, and you've got like your eyes doing this because it's bothering you so bad, you might have tinnitus, and you need to get that checked out. But
And there's no like,
yeah, there's
no
no
theories
nothing.
as to like why, like nothing, how it happens.
Well, why it happens, there seems to be this is why tinnitus got a lot of attention recently, was a lot of veterans who are coming back from campaigns where there were sort of concussive blows would have tinnitus, right? And so they would have problems with that. And so that's one of the reasons it got started getting a little more media attention a few years ago. But there's not, I mean, it seems like folks who have a big head injury or some sort of, impact like that, they're more likely to have tinnitus, but that's, yeah. One of the best remedies for tinnitus is box fans, right? So they will, it's white noise, right? So if you constantly like play some noise or like box fans, folks who have tinnitus will often just have fans turned on as high as they can all the time because that noise kind of drowns out the ringing in their ears.
Because I tell people I know with tinnitus, like, cure it somewhat.
Yeah, they're just dealing with the symptoms. They're just trying to alleviate the symptom, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they'll just turn on fans or white noise or some other source. Josh?
I think AirPods exacerbate it.
They don't help. In fact, I think, I don't know. Because tinnitus being a central, and earbuds are going to cause, that's going to be some sort of conduction issue, I think, right? Or some sensory neural, because that could cause damage to your hair cells. So I think, I don't know. We could try it. How many of you are willing to try to get tinnitus?
No, nothing.
No? Extra credit?
No, that'd be like, I need an automatic aid.
Half a point.
Right.
Like,
All the way through.
I.
They'll get you to make a study guide if one of us gets tinnitus.
Ooh. If I get a hitch in the head to give it to you, yeah.
I'll do it for a study guide.
All right, so here's a nice map of hearing dysfunction and sort of the different things we were talking about. Not too big of a deal. What are some things that can happen? Conductive hearing loss. Often, again, this can be treated by drugs, surgery, if you can kind of, remove blockages or straighten things out. Or this is where hearing aids work, right? So if you lose some ability to conduct that sound, you can use a hearing aid and kind of ramp that up. Sensory neural, that's irreversible. Nothing's going to happen there that's going to help you, right? Because you're losing those brain cells.
How do infections, like, what is the one that, like, everyone got a bajillion friggin' times? What is it called? Meningitis. Ha ha ha. When people get meningitis and then they go deaf.
Yeah, meningitis is nasty, so watch out for that.
Yeah, how does that work?
Yeah, so meningitis is an inflammation of the covering of your nervous system.
Then there you go.
Yeah, that's what happens. Yeah. And meningitis is serious business, right? How many of you have been vaccinated for that? Well, that's good. I appreciate that. Because if one of you gets meningitis, then you know we're all sunk.
Except for the people who are vaccinated.
Yeah. High five. Yeah, if you're not vaccinated, don't high five somebody. Go home, take a shower, and some peroxide, and come back.
Take a shower with peroxide.
Oh. All right, never mind. I just remembered I have a cast skull and peroxide at home I need to take care of when I get home.
I'm assuming ethically sourced.
I found it in the field. I don't know. I mean, I sourced it ethically. I don't know how it got in. I mean, but that's the thing, right? If you
Got
come up,
somebody's freaking cat, like,
I don't know.
pet that they buried.
I don't think so. It wasn't. It was like on the surface. I didn't like dig. Well, I take that back. This is before I moved. They were building some new apartments next to our apartment, and so I kind of went over there to see what was going on. And there was like something sticking up. I was like, hey, that's cool. What is that? And of course, it was a cast skull. Josh, I got to show it to the Boy Scouts Saturday.
Have you named it? I feel like you would name it.
Might name it Chandler.
Okay, some honor in that. Okay.
All right, so there we go. Also age. As you get older, your hair cells start to die.
Everything deteriorates.
Yeah, it does, right? Have fun. In particular, those high-frequency hair cells are going to become damaged and die. This is why they will often, in certain, like, I don't know, this was a thing they did in Walmart a few years ago. They had a bunch of kids who were stealing shoes. And so they would play this really high-frequency sound late at night in the shoe department to scare away kids. But the old folks would go in and they could buy their non-slip shoes or whatever because they couldn't hear the high-frequency noise. Kids will also do this with their phone notifications. They'll turn on that high frequency. Keep in mind, I'm not an earpod user, so I'm going to be able to hear those. So don't try it. In fact, I'm gonna start recording all of my lectures and crank up the frequency so that only those of you who use over-the-ear headphones can hear it.
That's not nice.
Teach you a
It's called
lesson.
evolution.
It's natural selection.
Sensory neural issues can cause a lot of problems because it's kind of a different issue. We can actually, if you start losing certain hair cells, you actually have what we call a broader frequency tuning. So when a frequency comes through and it's like a 1200 hertz frequency, it's going to activate the cells that are sensitive to 1200 hertz the most. But the cells that are sensitive to 11 or 1300 hertz are going to get a little activated, and 10 and 14, right? It's kind of going to go out in like a Gaussian, right, or like a standard distribution curve, right? And so what happens if you lose those guys in the middle? Then you're going to get like a bunch of them sort of activated. You're not going to be able to tell the difference, right? So you're not going to be able to tell the difference in those frequencies as well. You lose that frequency tuning. Oops. Oh well, points to remember. You don't need any of those. You got a question? Is it a good question?